The footage accelerated. Human ships retreating became human ships returning. The damaged vessels were rebuilt, sleeker now, with weapon systems that had not existed in the first engagement. Alien fleets that had swept humanity aside found themselves suddenly and inexplicably outgunned. The equations shifted with every confrontation. The great empires of that age grew afraid, Thessaly said, not of what humans were, of what humans were becoming. Every battle was a lesson. Every loss was a revision. They were rewriting themselves in real time, and the galaxy understood, perhaps too late, that there was no final version. There was only the next version, and it was always more dangerous than the last. The image changed. Council chambers not unlike this one. Ancient faces in urgent conference. So a decision was made. It was not discussed widely. It was not voted on by any democratic body. It was made by a small group of powerful beings who believed they were acting in the interest of galactic stability. Thessaly's voice did not waver, but the weight behind it was immense. They erased the human records. Every archive, every cultural database, every historical reference. Scrubbed, deleted, overwritten. Human worlds were destroyed. Human colonies were dismantled. And within 2 generations, the galaxy had convinced itself that humans had simply never existed. A long silence. They thought the silence meant success, Thessaly said. They thought absence meant extinction. He looked around the hall. But humans never sent a surrender signal. Not once. In all the records I have found, in the fragments, the overlooked files, the notes made by junior archivists who did not understand what they were documenting, there is no record of humanity surrendering. There is only a record of humanity going quiet. He turned to face Councilor Vex directly. And quiet, as we are beginning to understand, is not the same thing as gone. The alien patrol fleet was 5 ships strong, a standard deep space reconnaissance formation, running on routine protocols, expecting nothing. Their sector was the outer boundary, the dark margin between charted space and the void beyond, a posting so uneventful that crew assignments to it were considered a mild punishment. They found the object on their 3rd pass of the quadrant. From a distance, it appeared to be wreckage, a remnant of some ancient collision or battle, drifting cold and dead through the dark. Its surface was black and scarred, covered with damage that had clearly been inflicted across a very long time, layers of impact and erosion that spoke of centuries of exposure. There were no lights, no emissions, no heat signature. The patrol's instruments swept over it again and again and returned the same reading, inert. Dead metal, one of the crew said, not bothering to hide his boredom. Mark it for the salvage logs and move on. But the patrol commander, a methodical being named Herrick, was studying the object's shape. Something about it bothered him. The lines were too deliberate for natural debris. The angles were too precise. This had been built by someone who understood engineering at a very sophisticated level, and the design language, the sharp, heavy, purposeful architecture of it, matched nothing in the Drail database or any other. Hold position, he said, and then the object began to wake up. It happened slowly at first, a faint increase in energy readings, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing that might have been a sensor glitch. Then the surface began to change. Lines appeared across the hull, dim at first and then brighter, tracing patterns of extraordinary complexity. The patrol's translation systems ran the symbols through every known linguistic database and returned nothing. Unknown origin, unknown language. Pull back, Herrick ordered, and the fleet moved. They did not move fast enough. The object's engines came online without a heat burst, without an energy spike, without any of the signatures that marked every other propulsion system in the galaxy. There was simply stillness, and then there was movement, and the movement was so smooth and so controlled that it felt less like activation and more like a decision. A communication channel opened on all frequencies simultaneously. Static, then clarity. This is human scout vessel Watcher 1. The voice was calm, unhurried, carrying beneath its surface the particular confidence of someone who has already considered every possible outcome and prepared for all of them. You are inside restricted space. This is your only warning. Herrick's crew powered weapons on instinct. Targeting systems initialized, locked onto the human vessel, and then, one by one, failed. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply failed. Every targeting lock dissolved the moment it formed, as though the concept of locking onto the human ship was something the ship simply would not permit. "How?" one of his officers whispered. "How is it doing that?" The human ship did not answer. Instead, it broadcast one final message on every channel the patrol fleet possessed. "We were sent to observe," the voice said. "You were sent to patrol. You failed the test." The channel closed, and in the space between stars, where the darkness was deepest, new signals began to appear. Hundreds, then thousands. Not weapon signatures, not targeting locks, just presence, just a simple, overwhelming evidence of something that had been there for a very long time and had finally, quietly, decided to make itself known. The patrol fleet sat motionless as a dark between stars began, very slowly, to move. Stars disappeared. That was the first thing the patrol crew noticed. Not ships, not weapons, not the roar of engines across the void. Just the stars going out, one by one, then in clusters, then in sweeping sections, as though something vast was moving between the patrol fleet and the rest of the universe and blocking the light as it came. "Screen malfunction," one officer said. It was not a statement of belief. It was a prayer. The screens were not malfunctioning. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Slowly, because the darkness was deep and the ships were enormous, and it took time for something that large to fully resolve into sight. Their hulls were black in a way that was not simply dark, not the absence of light, but the active consumption of it, surfaces that absorbed every wavelength and reflected nothing. Each one was larger than the largest war carrier the Drael Empire had ever built. And they kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds, emerging from the void with the unhurried certainty of things that had been waiting for a very long time and had ceased to measure that waiting in any unit smaller than decades. "This is not a fleet," Commander Herrick said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "This is an answer." The human ships held position. They did not advance aggressively. They did not arm their weapons visibly. They simply arranged themselves in a configuration that left no meaningful avenue of escape, and then they waited with the patience of something that had long ago stopped worrying about time. A wideband transmission opened. The voice this time was different from Watcher One's, older, carrying a weight that suggested it had been chosen carefully for exactly this moment. "You erased us from your history," the voice said. There was no anger in it. Anger would have been easier to bear. There was something worse, certainty. "You called us myths. You convinced yourselves that silence was the same as death, and that if you simply did not look in our direction long enough, the problem of us would resolve itself." A flagship drifted forward from the center of the formation. It was larger than the others, so large that it occluded an entire star behind it, a celestial body that had burned for billions of years reduced to an afterthought by the sheer scale of human engineering. "We watched you grow," the voice continued. "We watched you build your empires and write your histories and erase our name from every record you could find. We watched you celebrate your long peace and tell yourself that the galaxy was safe and ordered and understood." A pause. "We watched you forget." The patrol fleet's weapons were charged. They knew it was pointless. They charged them anyway, because there is something in the hearts of beings facing the incomprehensible that insists on the performance of defiance even when defiance has no practical value. "We did not return for conquest," the human voice said. "We returned because you came too close." The transmission ended, and then a single alien cruiser, shaking, its crew overwhelmed by panic that had finally overridden judgment, fired. The plasma beam was the finest weapon in the cruiser's arsenal, capable of punching through 6 layers of standard military shielding. It traveled the distance between the cruiser and the nearest human battleship in less than a second. Space-bent. Not dramatically, not in the way of explosions or electromagnetic pulses, but subtly, like the surface of water disturbed by something moving beneath it. The plasma beam curved. It followed the curve obediently, the way light follows gravity around a massive object, and then it dissipated into nothing, spent and harmless against the void. The human battleship had not moved, had not fired back, had not even, as far as the patrol's instruments could determine, acknowledged the attack. It simply stood in place, and the attack had failed around it as naturally as rain fails to wet a stone beneath an overhang. Then the human fleet responded. There were no visible weapons, no bright beams, no missile contrails, none of the familiar signatures of any weapon system in the galactic registry. Small points of light moved along the hulls of the human ships, barely visible, almost decorative, and then, across the entire patrol fleet, every shield failed. Not degraded, not overwhelmed. Failed completely and instantly, as though the concept of a shield was something the humans had simply decided no longer applied. Engines shut down. Weapons went dark. 5 ships, fully crewed and battle-ready by every standard that existed in the known galaxy, had been rendered as helpless as debris in the space of a single breath. "This is impossible," an officer said, and no one argued with him, because the argument would have required them to propose an alternative, and no alternative existed. The human flagship moved forward. It fired one weapon, a single, precise pulse that struck an alien cruiser and cut it clean across its middle section with a precision so perfect that the two halves separated without any of the fire or explosive decompression that should have accompanied such a strike. It was a demonstration, not of destruction, but of control. "You still do not understand," the human voice said. "This is mercy. The weapons we used just now are not our primary systems. They are our warning shots. We disabled you without killing you because we chose to. We cut that vessel in half to show you that we could have done it to all of you at any moment, and we chose not to." Commander Herrick had stopped trying to think tactically. There was no tactical framework in which this situation made sense. He had moved past tactics into something older and simpler: listening. "You attacked us once because you feared our growth," the voice said. "You erased our name because you were afraid of what we were becoming. You thought extinction was the only defense against a species that would not stop learning." The flagship moved closer, not threateningly, thoughtfully, the way a speaker moves when they want to be sure they are heard. "We survived. We learned what it meant to be truly alone in the universe, without allies, without history, without even the acknowledgement that we had ever existed. We took that knowledge and we used it." A pause. "This fleet, these ships, these weapons, everything you see here, is not our military. It is not our full strength. It is not even our second strength." Across the galaxy, in the Council Hall, thousands of beings watched the transmission in complete silence. Not one of them was breathing. "This is our introduction," the human voice said quietly. "We wanted you to understand who you are speaking to before we began speaking." The alien ships floated, powerless, in the dark. Around them, the human fleet held position with the patience of deep time, neither advancing nor retreating, simply present in a way that made the space they occupied feel fundamentally different from space without them. Commander Herrick finally found his voice. It came out smaller than he intended. "What do you want from us?" The pause that followed was not dramatic. It was thoughtful, the pause of someone who had been asked a simple question and was deciding how to give it a simple answer. "Remember," the human voice said. "Just that, one word. Remember that we existed. Remember that you erased us. Remember why you erased us and what that erasure cost. Not us, not only us, but you. The knowledge we accumulated, the discoveries we made, the things we learned in 5 centuries of survival in the dark. You lost all of it. Every breakthrough, every insight, every solution we found to problems you have not yet thought to ask. You lost it because you were afraid." The voice was not accusing. It was something harder to respond to, matter of fact. "We are asking you to not make that mistake again." Images began transmitting across the open channel. Not weapon specifications, not territorial demands. Something else entirely. Data, scientific data, medical advances, astronomical discoveries, engineering solutions, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had spent 5 centuries with nothing to do but think, experiment, learn, and refine. Page after page, in every format the human archive possessed, translated into every galactic language with a fluency that spoke of very careful, very patient preparation. "We are not your enemies," the human voice said. "We never were. We were your proof that growth is not something to be feared and controlled. That a species that learns fast is not a threat to be eliminated. It is a potential to be embraced." A long pause. "We are also your proof that elimination does not work." The human fleet began to withdraw. One by one, the enormous dark ships powered back, moving away from patrol fleet with the same unhurried deliberateness with which they had arrived. Power returned to the alien vessels, not all at once, but gently, gradually, the way you might hand something back to someone you want to understand that it was never entirely theirs to begin with. The stars came back. The light returned. The void became familiar again, or almost familiar. Familiar in shape but change in meaning, the way a room changes when you learn something important inside it. Herrick sat in his commander's chair and looked at the data still scrolling across his screens. He understood that everything he had believed about the galaxy, about history, about the nature of the universe, had been built on a foundation with a deliberate hole in it. He understood that the hole had been put there by beings who believed they were being careful. He understood, finally, what it cost to forget. In the Galactic Council Hall, the lights came up slowly. Historian Thessaly stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by beings who had governed civilization for centuries and were now sitting very quietly, in the way of people who had just learned that the map they had been using is missing continent. No one spoke for a long time. Eventually, Councilor Vex, who had opened this session by declaring humans a myth, unfolded his arms and looked at the historian with the expression of someone performing a very painful kind of accounting. "What do they want?" he asked. It was the same question Herrick had asked, and the answer was the same. "They want to be remembered," Thessaly said. "Accurately. Not as myths, not as threats, not as a cautionary tale about what happens when a species grows too fast. As what they actually were, as what they actually are." "And if we don't?" another counselor asked. Thessaly did not answer immediately. He looked at the space where the star map had been, where the dark shape had appeared and vanished at the edge of the known galaxy. "They have been patient for 5 centuries, he said finally. "I do not think patience is something they will run out of." He paused. "But I also do not think that is the right question. The right question is whether we have learned anything from what we just witnessed. Because if we haven't, if our first instinct, after seeing all of this, is still to look for a way to contain them, to control them, to find the vulnerability that lets us put them back in the box, then we haven't learned a thing. And that might be worth examining." The council was quiet. In the weeks that followed, human history was restored to every major archive in the galaxy. The process was not simple or painless. There was resistance, denial, the predictable discomfort of institutions being asked to admit that their foundations rested on a deliberate lie. But it happened. The record was corrected. The hole was filled. Human signal posts appeared at the edge of known space, not military installations, not weapons platforms. Communication relays, beacons, the infrastructure of contact maintained by a civilization that had spent 500 years preparing for the moment when contact would be possible again, and had refused to begin it until the terms were right. And across the galaxy, in every language and every culture and every civilization that now had to reckon with the fact that it had participated, knowingly or not, in the erasure of an entire species, one truth settled into the common understanding like a stone sinking into deep water. Humans had not survived because they were the strongest. They had not returned because they sought power. They had endured 5 centuries of silence and exile and complete erasure from history, and they had emerged from that darkness not bitter and not broken, but patient, deliberate, unchanged in the ways that mattered. They had survived because they refused to become something they were not. Because every time the universe had told them that the cost of survival was their own identity, their curiosity, their adaptability, their refusal to accept a ceiling on what they could learn, they had paid the other cost instead. They had chosen the harder, longer, lonelier road. They had simply endured. In the deep archives of the restored human records, scholars across the galaxy found a single document that had survived the erasure, a message written in the early days of humanity's self-imposed exile, addressed to no one in particular, intended perhaps only as a reminder to themselves. "We will not go quietly. We will not be made into myths. We will not be reduced to a warning or a story or a footnote in someone else's history. We are not a cautionary tale. We are not finished. We are only resting. And when the galaxy is ready to remember us as we actually are, we will be there. We have always been there. We were only waiting for you to look." Far beyond the edge of known space, in a region no current map would ever fully capture, something ancient and enormous continued its long, slow observation, watching, as it had always watched, patient, as it had always been patient. The lights of its vast fleet burned cold and quiet in the dark between galaxies, and the beings aboard them did not mourn the centuries they had lost. They had spent those centuries becoming something the galaxy was not yet ready to name. The stars, for the first time in 500 years, did not seem quite so indifferent. And somewhere in the dark between them, humanity smiled and waited and was finally, irrevocably, completely remembered. The Galactic Council Hall was a cathedral of power. Its ceiling stretched hundreds of meters overhead, carved from the black stone of an extinct moon, etched with the histories of 1,000 civilizations and the names of 1,000 wars. Rings of tiered seating encircled a central platform where a holographic star map rotated slowly, casting pale blue light across the faces of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Every seat was filled. Every species was represented. And yet, for all its grandeur and all its history, the whole was profoundly silent. Councillor Vex of the Drael Empire sat at the front of the first tier, his forearms folded across his broad chest, his iridescent eyes fixed on the map. He had been in this chamber for 3 centuries. He had witnessed the collapse of the Seren Confederation, the long peace that followed the Meridian Accords, the slow expansion of civilized space into the dark corridors between stars. He had seen much. He believed he had seen everything. He had never seen humans. "They are a fable," he said, his voice low but carrying perfectly across the silence. "A legend invented to frighten young soldiers and give poets something to write about. They are not real. They have never been real." Several heads around the circle nodded. The Galactic Council had debated this subject before, not often, and always briefly. There were no human ships on any patrol route. No human signals had been intercepted. No human worlds appeared on any star chart. The galaxy had been quiet for centuries, and in that quiet, most had come to accept the simplest explanation. Humans were a story, nothing more. But the historian at the edge of the chamber was not nodding. His name was Orin Thessaly, and he was the oldest living scholar in the Council's employ. His body was thin in the way of very old things, not frail, but compressed, as though centuries of knowledge had packed themselves tightly beneath his pale skin. He had spent 400 years studying the gaps in galactic history, the places where records did not simply end but had been deliberately removed. He had always found those gaps more frightening than anything the records themselves contained. "Our archives say the humans vanished following what is called a Great Silence," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath the calm, an unease he had carried for decades. All data pertaining to their civilization was lost. Their language, their star systems, their biology, their history. He paused. Lost or erased. The word landed differently than the others. Erased. It implied intention. It implied that someone had wanted those records gone, had worked carefully and deliberately to remove every trace of an entire species from the memory of the galaxy. The whole, already quiet, became something more than quiet. Then the alarms began. A junior communications officer burst through the side entrance of the chamber, a movement sharp with a particular urgency of someone who had run the entire length of the corridor. Her breath was controlled, but her hands, all 6 of them, were trembling slightly as she brought up the display. "Counselors," she said, "we have intercepted a signal from deep space. Origin, beyond the outer boundary markers. Age estimation, older than most of the civilizations currently seated in this hall." Silence turned to stillness. No one moved. "Play it," Councillor Vex said. The officer pressed a sequence of controls. Static filled the hall, rough, broken, layered with a particular kind of interference that only accumulates across vast distances and vast time. But beneath the static, something else. A rhythm, a cadence, a voice. It was not alien. It did not carry the harmonic resonance of Drael speech, nor the clicking consonants of the Veth, nor the musical inflections of the Elder Ones. It was none of those things. It was something older, something the universal translation system flagged with a single word before rendering it into every language in the room simultaneously. Human. This message is for anyone who finds it. The voice was male, deep, rough with something that might have been exhaustion or might have been grief. "We want you to know. We did not fall. We did not die. We made a choice. And we are still here. We are still watching." Not one of the hundreds of beings in the hall made a sound. If you are hearing this, it means the galaxy has forgotten us. It means the erasure worked, at least for a time. A pause. The static swelled, then receded. "We want you to know that forgetting was never something we did. That was always your habit, not ours." The star map flickered. Every eye in the room moved to it. At the very edge of the display, beyond the outermost ring of charted space, in the region labeled simply unknown in faded script, a shape appeared. It was enormous. It was dark. It was moving, not drifting, not tumbling, but moving with a deliberate, unhurried momentum of something that had decided to move and had not yet found a reason to stop. Then the signal ended. The shape vanished. The map returned to its slow rotation as though nothing had happened. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then historian Thessaly stepped forward into the central light, and the expression on his face was not fear exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of having always known something terrible was true, and finally being given permission to say it aloud. "There is something else," he said quietly, "something the galaxy chose not to remember. And I think the time for that particular choice has passed." The lights in the hall dimmed. The star map retracted. In its place, a new image bloomed across the central platform, older footage, grainy and compressed, from an age before the current empires had formed, before the Meridian Accords, before the long peace that everyone in this room had always taken to be the natural state of the universe. It showed a war. Humans were not the strongest species the galaxy had ever produced, Thessaly said, his voice steady even as the images shifted and expanded around him. They were not the largest, not the most technologically advanced, not the most numerous. By almost every conventional metric, they were unremarkable. The footage showed human ships, small by galactic standards, lightly built, many of them visibly damaged. They moved through the debris fields of enormous battles, pursued by vessels 3 and 4 times their size. But they had a quality that no other species in recorded history possessed to the same degree, Thessaly continued. When they lost, they learned, not gradually, not slowly. When humans suffered a defeat, they returned from it different, faster, sharper, better. They adapted at a rate that defied every predictive model the empires possessed.